Hello viewers, I am Professor Anuradha from the Department of Social Work, Sri Padmavati Mahila Vishwavidyalaya, Tirupati. Welcome to this lessons on the process of casework. Let's start with a brief introduction. Casework, when we are practicing, whether it is a short-term casework or a long-term casework, it moves into phases like any other helping professions. The time, the content, and the process, of course, varies depending on the nature of the issues that have to be dealt with in the process. Nonetheless, it begins with an initial phase, or we call it as a beginning phase, which consists of study and assessment. Then we enter into an intermediate phase, which involves intervention, and then it has an ending or a termination phase. The content of the casework process varies from person to person, as we discussed earlier, and it depends upon the individual's personality makeup and also the collaboration that has been established between the client and the caseworker. What are the objectives of our lesson? What are we looking for? The basic objectives of this particular lesson, as soon as we complete this particular section, you should be in a position to explain the importance of casework process. You should also be able to explain or differentiate between the different stages of casework process, and lastly, explain the skills involved in understanding the process of casework. Now let us begin with the process of casework. Social casework is a dynamic interaction between the caseworker and the client, wherein the underlying purpose is to help the client achieve a better adjustment between him and his environment. Casework is an important channel through which the capacities of the client are mobilized, enabled, and attention is focused on, working through the problems or needs expressed. Thus, such an enabling process proceeds from an initial phase, enters one or more intermediate phases, and then ends in termination and follow-up. In the context of casework process, in particular, Mary Richmond in 1917 provided the three classic phases of casework, that is, social investigation or psychosocial study, diagnosis and treatment or management, and in contemporary practice, casework process has been divided into 5 phases, which are as follows: study or fact finding, that is social investigation; assessment, which is also called as diagnosis; intervention, that is treatment; termination, and evaluation. Needless to say, we should bear in mind that these are logical sequence that we follow. Nonetheless, they are not watertight compartments. It's not that we start with the study phase and wait for some days to do intervention. No. Depending on the client's need, it is a cyclical process wherein the stages go forward and backwards. But nonetheless, for the sake of clarity, we classify them into these stages. Now students, let us look at all these stages in detail. We'll look at each and basic quality or the characteristics of each of these phases. We'll start with the study phase. We'll try to understand what exactly goes into this particular study phase, or called as the fact-finding phase. This is the initial phase of casework, which is the foundation upon which the various helping processes, actions, and treatment techniques are built. It is an indispensable stage as it helps to study the social realities of the clients and their families, identify the problem areas, and formulate intervention strategies therein. Social work experts term this stage as social inquiry, social investigation, fact-finding, intake, and orientation, and some others as the beginning phase. Whatever the terminology used in this stage or phase, caseworker focuses on the following issues. Caseworker begins this stage by building rapport with the client. The interview is initiated by gathering the background details of the client. In this process, caseworker begins to gain a picture of the client's problem chronologically. Caseworker makes a note of the major concerns of the client, how they began, the severity, probable causes, location, and effect of the problem on the personal, social, occupational, biological functioning of the client. Information is also sought on the impact of the problem on the household dynamics, attitudes, and reactions of the client towards the problem, client's perception of the problem, efforts made by the client to deal or cope with this problem, help sort from other sources, general personality characteristics of the client, and past history of the client. That is, the relevant information from the past, including childhood, which has its influence on the present situation. Pertinent information about the education, work history, marital history, family history, social conditions, and impact of religious, economic, and political institution is also elicited in this particular section. Now, let us look at what are the techniques. Because study phase, which is the initial phase, is a foundation phase. What techniques that as students you must learn? You have to start building this particular phase by using techniques such as open questioning. You have to probe into the information, engage in active listening, observe, explain, and also go deep into delving into the life of the person to gain adequate information. What are the sources of information that provide us the necessary information? Sources of information are when we conduct an interview with our clients, when we observe our clients, and when we make collateral visits, that is, to their places of work or places of study. And also the earlier records and documents used or stored in the agency serve as a major source of information. Now, since this is the beginning stage, client has to be oriented to the purpose of this session. Caseworker is a stranger and the client feels ambivalent about the value of the sessions. Hence, the caseworker needs to clarify the importance of participation and help the client to get accustomed to the new helping situation. This is the stage in which caseworker can engage the client in talking about his problem in a non-threatening, safe and respectful atmosphere. This marks the beginning for a working relationship in which the motivation of the client is enhanced and the client begins to think about the need to work on his problems. So that's about the study or the fact-finding phase. As we have seen earlier, the study phase is followed by an assessment phase. Now let us try to have a detailed look at what do we mean by assessment? What happens in this particular stage? Assessment plays an important role in the casework process. The purpose of assessment is to gain an understanding of the client's problem, situation, and plan strategies for intervention. Thus, it's an evaluation of the various factors such as the problem, people, and the situation and the interrelations between them. So, it is an explanation formulated in light of the known facts. Assessment is a continuous process of interaction between the caseworker and the client. It is subject to change or revision whenever the subsequent information gathered warrants different explanation. Thus, accurate assessment is a crucial element in the casework process. Though assessment is the second stage in the casework process, it actually begins with the previous stage itself, that is, the study phase, wherein the data gathering process starts. It is a close scrutiny of the client situation configuration, that is, the nature of the problem, nature of the person, and the purview of the agency in the helping process. Assessment is analysis of the factors influencing the problem, namely physical, psychological, social, and economic. The assessment product focuses on the current forces operating on the client, in the environment, and between him and the environment. Physical conditions of the client and the factors leading to the client's problem are also assessed. Assessment does not include the following, that is, specific problem behavior and existing strengths, resources within and outside the client. A clear, precise explanation of the target behavior goals to be achieved. A summary of the factors influencing the problem, and selection of the priority areas for intervention. The sources of information for assessment again are interview, observation, collateral visits. Now students, what are the techniques that we need bear in mind again when we are doing an assessment? The techniques that were mentioned earlier, such as open questioning, which is a very important aspect, engaging with the client, active listening, observing, giving information as and when necessary. And another important key techniques are reflecting on whatever the client has said. So, when you learn those, bear in mind they need to be used effectively when we are doing this particular assessment. So, having finished about study phase and assessment phase, now let's go on to the intervention phase. Now, what do we mean by intervention? Intervention phase is the sum total of all activities and services that are directed towards helping the client in relieving his immediate problems and modifying the factors that precipitated it. This is the working phase in which the client has identified his needs and goals with intensified personal involvement and expresses his feelings and ideas more actively. This is a phase where the roles and responsibilities of the caseworker and client are further clarified. There is strengthening of the caseworker and client relationship and working towards the established treatment goals. In this phase, client is helped acquire and use knowledge and skills to solve the defined problem. This is done by helping the client to identify his own capacities and resources as well as outside resources that are relevant to his need. The basic aim of this phase is to help the client to come back to his normal state of functioning, experience growth and development, experience sense of direction, learn the art of decision making, understand his inner conflicts, express his positive and negative feelings, and finally develop a focus. The intervention techniques that are used to directly help the client are therapeutic interviewing and counseling that involves clarification, interpretation, confrontation, reflection, and paraphrasing. Supportive techniques such as sensitive listening, expression of caring, realistic approval, encouragement, facilitating ventilation, providing information and direction, and identification of and mobilization of social support also play a key role. Indirect interventions also are done. Indirect interventions by way of environmental modification has been proved to be effective in the history of social work. This refers to the changes brought out in the social environment of the clients. Persons and situations in the environment are modified in terms of their attitude and services. Activities such as camps, group experiences, visits, training, etc., are incorporated into the client's milieu. These help the client experience growth and adjust to the circumstances. Practical services are also provided to the clients. They may include financial help, legal aid, medical care, admission into the residential care, etc., provision of prosthesis, creation of recreational facilities, providing mobility aids, etc. And these are done so because the clients may need them to resolve their problems in daily living. So, when we look back, we have now looked at the intervention phase. In the intervention phase, we have looked at intervention techniques that are directly used while working with the clients. We have also looked at intervention techniques that indirectly help the clients. And then we have also had a look at the techniques that are very important when we are working with our clients because they are the key to intervention. Having seen all the three stages, now let's move on to the termination stage. This refers to the ending of the casework process, or in other words, it is a gradual decrease of contacts between the caseworker and the client. This is a stage wherein meetings are reduced once the client has learned the skills to deal with this problem, and also new issues that may arise in the future course of time are dealt with. This is also a phase that has to be planned and should not be an abrupt one. This is so because the caseworker and the client may have had a number of sessions and the clients may have deep feelings about the separation. Since caseworker has helped the clients to cope with the difficult situation, they should also be prepared for the termination phase. Follow up should be planned on a progressively diminishing basis. This stage is followed by another stage, that is the evaluation stage. Having terminated the case, the client has to evaluate what has happened in the casework process. So now let us look at what are the characteristics of the evaluation phase. Evaluation is the stage during which the caseworker gauges the efficacy of the casework process. It is a process during which caseworker takes stock of the situation and takes feedback about the goals achieved, looks back and sees whether there's a need for any modification in the casework process. Evaluation of the client in terms of the strengths gained, coping strategies learned are also a part of the evaluation process. In this section on casework process, we began to look at the different stages. That is, the study stage or the fact finding stage, wherein we focus on gathering the pertinent details of the problem or the predicament that the client has faced. Now, how do we practice it? How do we go about implementing these particular stages? Now, the study phase, which we already looked at, it begins with establishing rapport with our client. What do we do to build rapport? We need to create that conducive environment while we are working with our clients. So, exchange of pleasantries, finding their background, the reason for coming, making them comfortable, seated comfortably, and helping them to compose themselves to start talking about their problem. That would form the basis. In other words, as you all say, ice breaking, because we are strangers, make them feel comfortable. That would build the ideal atmosphere for studying. From the study phase, we move on to the assessment phase, where we try to assess the factors that have influenced the problem. And assessment, as we see, is a continuous process and it is subject to change, and the explanations of the factors influencing the problem also vary depending upon the information that the clients give us. And from the assessment phase, we move on to the intervention phase, where we try to directly intervene on the factors that have been impinging on the client. And when we say intervene, we try to facilitate the client in resolving his problems. And as the client begins to cope effectively with his problems, we draw towards the ending of the casework process, that is the termination phase. This is done in such a way that the client does not feel the separation, and it is planned in an effective manner so that the client comfortably withdraws from the caseworker. Once the intervention is done and the termination is over, it's also time for the caseworker to look back at what he has done. So, these are the 5 stages through which the case progresses when we are working with the client.